Chilcot's damning indictment. There was no imminent threat from Saddam. Plans for the aftermath were wholly inadequate, and Blair should not have given Bush unconditional support.
The UK chose to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort.
I will be with you, whatever. Tony Blair's fateful message to George Bush a full 8 months before the invasion of Iraq. This is it. Sir John Chilcot's report, 7 years in the making. A quietly devastating forensic account of slapdash government taking British troops to unnecessary war, poorly planned and altogether unplanned once it came to life after Saddam. From Tony Blair to the Foreign Office to the generals in the MOD, the findings are excoriating. Saddam was not the threat described. We relied on flawed intelligence. The United Nations was undermined and the consequences of war underestimated. Above all, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died. The families of the British dead were looking on as this report was unveiled.
Look me in the eye.
Yeah.
Look me in the eye.
Why did you kill my son? Send my son to be killed?
A visibly emotional Tony Blair did express sorrow, but this was no full apology. He defiantly said removing Saddam was the right thing to do.
I express more sorrow, regret, and apology than you may ever know or can believe.
Tonight, we bring a mother who lost her son on the battlefield face to face with the general who commanded him and the new Labour politician who dispatched him to war.
The catalogue of mistakes and shortcomings in the report goes on to include devastatingly inadequate planning for the aftermath of the invasion, including failure to appreciate the potential for the Sunni-Shia sectarian war that is now tearing Iraq apart. 179 British servicemen and women died in the conflict. Thousands more were crippled and maimed. We speak to some of their mothers today and ask them if the report gives them the answers they have been waiting for so long.
Tony Blair robbed me of my son's life and of my life.
And in Iraq itself, the aftermath of the war America and Britain chose to start continues to be felt. The number of Iraqis killed in last weekend's suicide bombing alone has now climbed to more than 250.
Just weeks after 9/11, Tony Blair was writing to George Bush that he had no doubt we need to deal with Saddam. And over the following months, he set out a strategy for doing so. The Chilcot report does not make a judgment on the legality of the war, nor does it call Mr. Blair a liar, but it sets out a devastating catalogue of failures at every level of the British state. It says the decision to go to war was based on flawed intelligence and assessments, which should have been challenged, but were instead presented with a certainty that was not justified. Military action was launched before other options had been exhausted, and at a time when Saddam Hussein posed, quotes, no imminent threat. The decision to act without a second UN resolution undermined Security Council authority. The consequences of the invasion were underestimated, and planning and preparation for what happened afterwards were wholly inadequate. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, looks now at the Chilcot judgment and how the shockwaves of the report have rippled through the corridors of power.
13 years after around 1 million people came onto the streets of London to try to stop the war, a tiny demonstration, and after 7 years in the making, the inquiry verdict. Sir John Chilcot said the Iraq war was a failed mission. The invasion in March 2003 should not have happened.
We have concluded that the UK chose to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort.
The report shows Tony Blair was talking about war in Iraq even earlier than some of his critics have suggested. It reveals that just 4 weeks after the 9/11 attacks, Tony Blair wrote to President Bush, "I have no doubt that we need to deal with Saddam. However, I am sure we can devise a strategy for Saddam deliverable at a later date." And in December, in a phone call with the President, Mr. Blair said, "Contrary to press reporting, I am not in a different place on this. It would be excellent to get rid of Saddam. But there needs to be a clever strategy for doing this. Later adding, an extremely clever plan would be required. The memo and transcript turned up as part of the inquiry show even before George Bush did his famous axis of evil speech, equating Iraq, Iran and North Korea as countries that supported terrorism and wanted nuclear weapons. Tony Blair was willing to engage with the idea of attacking Iraq. And just a few months later, against the advice of his aides, he was even more direct. In a memo in July 2002 to President Bush, Tony Blair opens up with the phrase, "I will be with you, whatever." The inquiry echoes previous reports that have said the intelligence on Iraq's weapons of mass destruction was exaggerated and misrepresented. It says the then head of the Joint Intelligence Committee, Sir John Scarlett, later head of MI6, should have pointed that out. There was, it says, too much groupthink, not enough challenge in the intelligence world. One of the toughest judgments on Mr. Blair is that warnings of what could go wrong in Iraq were not heeded, as sectarianism exploded and all order collapsed. In an emotional press conference this afternoon, Tony Blair said this could not have been foreseen.
The aftermath turned out to be more hostile, protracted and bloody than ever we imagined. The coalition planned for one set of ground facts and encountered another. And a nation whose people we wanted to set free and secure from the evil of Saddam became instead victim to sectarian terrorism. For all of this, I express more sorrow, regret, and apology than you may ever know or can believe.
We do not agree that hindsight is required. The risks of internal strife in Iraq, active Iranian pursuit of its interests, regional instability, and al-Qaeda activity in Iraq were each explicitly identified before the invasion.
The inquiry team said there was no strategy rethink to cope with increased violence, lack of military strength on the ground.
The scale of the UK effort in post-conflict Iraq never matched the scale of the challenge. Whitehall departments and their ministers failed to put collective weight behind the task. In practice, the UK's most consistent strategic objective in relation to Iraq was to reduce the level of its deployed forces.
The report accused Tony Blair of giving unconditional support to the United States, extracting no proper input into critical decisions in return. Families who attended the publication of the report said Mr. Blair should have been there with them, not at his own press conference.
One thing I find very interesting that you're all reading from your phones, but why is he not here looking at us? If he's so sure of his decision, why is he not here looking at our eyes and actually seeing our faces?
And years ago we did ask to meet him and he walked away, so this is his opportunity to
Even
come
when
in
he
and
gave
speak
his-
to the families now.
When he gave his evidence, it was definitely the Tony Blair show. He thinks he's the puppet master pulling the strings. Well, you know, Tony.
But do you know, we've proved him wrong because everything Bill said for the start has actually come out today. And I think he thought they're going to give up and walk away.
What would you say to him if he was here?
Exactly what I've been saying to the world. Look me in the eye.
Yeah.
Look me in the eye.
Why did you kill my son? Send my son to be killed?
The report criticises the Attorney-General for the way he came to his view on the legality of war. They don't come to a judgment themselves, they always said they wouldn't. But they tiptoed pretty close. Whereas Tony Blair said he was upholding the authority of the United Nations Security Council by going to war, this report says he was undermining it. This afternoon, the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, a long-standing critic of the war, spoke to an audience including families of soldiers who died in the conflict.
Politicians and political parties can only grow stronger by acknowledging when they get it wrong and by facing up to their mistakes. So I now apologise sincerely on behalf of my party for the disastrous decision to go to war in Iraq. The apology is owed first to all the people of Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost and the country is still living with the devastating consequence of the war and the forces it unleashed.
But this report makes it clear, whatever criticisms you make or whether you agree or disagree with the decision, I did it for the reasons I said I did it. And I stand by it today for those reasons, again, today.
Tony Blair hopes the liar label that has haunted him since Iraq has been dealt a blow by this report.
Okay.
But for the families who lost loved ones and critics of the war, even if they drop that accusation, there's no shortage of other material in this report.
Well, I went down to Mr. Blair's press conference to tackle him on that key revelation that he promised President Bush that Britain would be with the US, whatever. That does sound, and it was read by the Americans, like a blank cheque for war.
Well, first of all, it
And
wasn't.
did you do enough to disabuse them of their reading of that as a blank cheque for war?
First of all, by the way, as the correspondence, not least between Colin Powell and Jack Straw makes clear, they didn't read it in that way. Neither could they have, because in July 2002, the whole purpose of my intervention with the president was to get him to go down the UN route. So after July 2002 comes November's UN resolution. Has Saddam complied with the UN resolution? That would have been the end of the matter. He didn't. But it was absolutely clear, and by the way, I think it's clear, I think even the words that continue after that statement in the memorandum, I think there is then a but, and I then explain all the difficulties and why this isn't like Kosovo and Afghanistan, why we have to proceed with enormous care. And the whole purpose of what I was doing was making it clear I was going to be with the Americans in dealing with this. That was absolutely clear. I said this in evidence to the inquiry, but we needed to go down the UN route.
But the but was never, I will withdraw my support if you don't go along with these conditions.
No, the but was, but we have to go down the UN route. So if we don't go down the UN route, I'm not in a position where I can support this.
Well, let's go to our political editor, Gary Gibbon in Westminster. Gary, what does this change?
I think it creates a lot of work for lawyers. You don't get a report this damning and not the possibility of some civil court action. I think amongst the military, an awful lot of pain for the senior military. I mean, the word humiliated is used in this report. One of the lessons, they've probably learned it already, but it's spelt out very clearly, is the British military doesn't have the strength, the resources to fight on two major fronts as it was trying to do in Iraq and Afghanistan. And on the whole question of political elites, which is so much at the front of our minds after the EU referendum, Tony Blair was saying there that he rather hopes what people come away thinking is that he didn't lie and that this particular part, part of our political past, part of our past political elite, is better than they thought. I really don't think that that is the takeaway, listening to this report tonight, that a lot of people will go with.
Thanks, Gary. John.
One of the men who was at the very centre of the judgments being made about the invasion of Iraq was the then Foreign Secretary Jack Straw. I caught up with him a little earlier. I asked him, had he been enthralled to Tony Blair?
The processes of government.
No, I'm asking, were you enthralled?
Of course I
to
wasn't.
No, that's a straight answer. Yes or no? Were you or were you not?
Of course I was not. Of course I wasn't.
So why did you go along with all this? Because it's so counter to many of the things which you state you disagreed with. You were dissatisfied that the war would either be ever won. You thought it would be very long. You thought it would be unsuccessful. I mean, why did you go along with all this?
I went along with it because I believed, as the whole of the international community believed, that Saddam Hussein posed a threat to international peace and security because of his holdings of weapons of mass destruction. That was my belief, genuine and well-founded, on the basis of intelligence and much else that we knew, including what Saddam had done and what Saddam had had in the recent past.
The real climax of this horrific story is that actually the great public loss of confidence in the political classes rests on what happened in that war. In the subterfuge, the mistrust, the elasticity with the truth, all of these things undermined people's trust in British governance.
I accept that crucially, the failure to find WMD and the fact that it transpired after we'd invaded Iraq, that Saddam had no holdings of WMD at the time, has profoundly undermined trust in British politics. Of course I accept that.
One final thing which Mr. Blair has found difficult to do. Would you find it in yourself to look into the camera and apologise to the families of the soldiers who died in what you did?
Well, I'm profoundly sorry for the loss of life that took
Can you
place.
say it to the families?
Well, of course I can. I'm profoundly sorry for the loss of life that happened in Iraq, particularly, but not exclusively, those who lost their lives serving the United Kingdom. And I understand their grief and their sorrow. I hope in turn that this will be incredibly difficult for people to accept. It will be accepted that when I made my decisions, which included recommending to Parliament that British service personnel and civilians were put in harm's way, that we did so in good faith and for reasons which we thought were justified at the time.
The Foreign Secretary at the time, Jack Straw. Matt.
These are the images of the 179 British troops who died in Iraq. Some of their bereaved relatives, widows, parents, brothers, sisters travelled to Westminster today to read the Chilcot report and take their seats in the audience as Sir John announced his conclusions. As you've seen, the pride in their loved ones was mixed with a bitterness about the circumstances in which they died. But not all the families wanted to travel to London today. Jackie Long has spoken to 2 mothers and an injured veteran who've had to live with the consequences. Jackie's film does contain some distressing images.
I think Iraq was like our Vietnam. There was a point where we started coming home broken and we started coming home, you know, draped in flags.
Tony Blair robbed me of my son's life and of my life.
And if it had been for a good enough reason, maybe then we could all accept it a bit better. But there was no reason there, really. Just to put some bloke out of power that they didn't like.
"34-year-old Staff Sergeant Sharon Elliott joined the army straight after leaving school. She'd served in Kosovo and Northern Ireland and was brave and fearless, says her mother. Getting the call to go to Iraq in 2006, though, was different.
I said to her, are you afraid? And it's the first time she's ever said yes. That she was. Sorry. She was frightened to go.
And as her mum, that must have been very tough.
Well, I've never heard her say that before. It's as if she knew.
Sharon Elliott only had that first week in Iraq. She was killed just 7 days after arriving. She was on a boat patrol in the Shatt al-Arab waterway in Basra when it was hit by a bomb. It was Remembrance Sunday.
For the first 6 years, I had a recurring dream. I was in a boat, but I couldn't get it out. She was just stuck. It's not there as much now, but it still comes back. Because you're not there, you see. If your child falls, you're there to pick them up. But in our cases, we're not.
Elsie says the report confirms what she always believed, that Tony Blair chose to invade Iraq before all other options were exhausted. In doing so, she says, he signed her daughter's death warrant.
It was an illegal war Tony Blair took them into. They weren't equipped. They couldn't defend themselves. You don't send a plumber to do a job and not give them the tools to work, do you?
The bullet went in my left cheek, came out my right cheek, obviously smashed both cheekbones, broke my jaw in 4 places.
Simon Brown had just rescued 6 of his colleagues from a broken vehicle in Basra when he was hit by a sniper.
It didn't cross your mind at that moment that you might die?
No. I genuinely thought a couple of weeks hospital chatting up nurses and that'd be me. But yeah, got that wrong.
Simon lost his left eye and has only slight vision in his right. Over the next few years, he was to have 22 operations to rebuild his face. If it took a superhuman effort to stay alive that day, the effort to quell feelings of anger and bitterness about the war has perhaps been as great.
We weren't ready for it. You know, we'd spent the last 30, 40 years preparing for a war in Northern Europe. And then all of a sudden, we went to a desert.
But so many people will be looking at you and not understanding why you are not more angry, more outraged by what happened to you, what happened to your friends.
I hope people don't judge me, you know. Like I say, I've got to move on. I've got to move past it, you know. And me being angry is not going to change anything. It's not going to bring anyone back. It's not going to fix my eyesight. I've got to believe that they fought and died for something, because it's too poisonous not to think that. And I can't let myself believe that their lives were pointless.
What would that do to you?
It did break me. It took me straight back to that place I was in when I woke up in hospital.
Michael was a typical mummy's boy, because where I was, Michael was.
It's almost 10 years since Janice Proctor's son Michael died, and her anger has grown. He was just 18 when he was killed by a roadside bomb in a war she still believes was based on one man's lie.
And this is what Tony Blair did to me. He ripped the carpet from under my feet. He had my life in turmoil. My marriage broke down. I did not want to know my other two children, because I was so focused on Michael because of his lies. They called Saddam the monster. I loathe this man. Tony Blair's the monster. He has devastated, he has killed so many people.
The report proves there were no lies, Tony Blair said today, no dishonesty. But while he faces condemnation and criticism, Janice Proctor hoped for something more than strong words.
To be criticised for 179 lives, I think that's a little bit polite.
For Elsie, 7 years of waiting and 2.6 million words can't sum up what she's lost.
Tell me what you miss about Sharon.
Just everything. She's my baby, my daughter, my friend. Before she was a soldier. He's a big miss. I just loved her so much.
Jackie Long talking there to some of those who have suffered as a result of the Iraq War. Another of those who died was Gordon Gentle from Glasgow. He was killed by an IED in June 2004. His mother, Rose, attended today's event where she condemned Tony Blair, who she says is responsible for murdering her son. In the years since her son died, she has become one of the most prominent campaigners for the truth behind the invasion, as well as the co-founding the Military Families Against the War group, which campaigned for the withdrawal of British troops from Iraq. She joins us now, along with General Sir Mike Jackson, who was head of the British Army during the invasion of Iraq, and Lord Faulkner, the former Lord Chancellor, who was a close ally of Tony Blair and supported the invasion in 2003. And Rose Gentle, you have been trying to reach Tony Blair for some face-to-face, but you can't, and I'm wondering what you would say to his friend Charlie Faulkner.
The families were just really asking. Gordon was killed 12 years ago, and we had asked Tony Blair for a face-to-face meeting, and the response I got back from him was a meeting with you would be impossible. And I just wanted a meeting with the man that sent my son to Iraq. And they never gave us a meeting, and that's why we kept saying, well, if he's not going to meet with the families, we need to speak up for ourselves. But it's still to the day, he refused to meet any of the families.
Well, I mean, he should obviously meet the families, and I'm quite sure that you wouldn't agree. And I mean, he obviously feels very, very deeply what happened. Obviously, not remotely the sort of pain that you're feeling, but he, I'm sure, would be willing to see you.
But if he feels that way, why is he just feeling it today? How has he not felt it 12 years ago when I lost Gordon in Iraq? And then came face me and told us how he felt then?
Well, I think he's been feeling it every day since the invasion started and British soldiers died.
No, honestly, I think if he'd had any remorse, he'd have done it years ago, and that might have prevented us asking a lot of questions and fighting for a lot of questions. If he'd have sat down with families and went, this is what happened. We could have said, right, at least he has decency to meet with us and explain stuff. But he's left it so long now, that's why we don't even trust him now.
Well, I mean, I am sure that he would see you, and I am sure that it would be right that you did have an exchange.
Would you mention it to him?
Of course, yes.
Can I just ask you about your own role? Because the legal advice about going to war was absolutely critical. And you are accused within the report of having pressured the Attorney General to change his legal advice.
Well, no such thing occurred. I didn't realise I was criticised in the report for that.
What, did you?
No, I did not.
So how come he changed his advice so dramatically in the space of 10 days?
Well, he didn't see me during those 10 days, and he thought, having spoken to other people, that he had a different view about the legal position. But it was not as a result of talking to me.
It's quite a screechy U-turn, isn't it?
Well,
From saying the war was illegal, that we had to get that second resolution of the United Nations, suddenly to say, well, actually, you can go.
He says that there are two views, and one view forms one that both are reasonably a reasonable basis for going to war, though he accepts that there's a contrary view.
What would you like to say to the general who was leading the British military effort?
Do you know, I have not got a problem with the forces at all. They were totally going to do their job, and they went there, they were taking orders.
At the end of the day, it is our duty to follow the direction of the duly elected government.
But I wonder, was there ever a moment when you told Tony Blair the truth, that this was an unwinnable mission?
Forgive me, but...
you never saw him?
No.
Well, did you ever tell anybody...
Well, in the Chiefs of State, it's very important this is understood.
Did you tell the Minister of Defence that this was an unwinnable war?
No, because that was not my assessment, that it was unwinnable.
But, I mean, how much did you know? You were being asked to go to a foreign field.
What I was quite clear about is that the immediate objective, so-called Phase 3, was the defeat of Saddam Hussein's armed forces in the field, and that never concerned me. That was not possible. It was the aftermath, so-called Phase 4, where I had real concerns.
But, you see, Sir John Chilcot says, for example, that the kit, all sorts of things, there were enormous problems. And many of the men didn't even have desert boots. You had that young man there saying, you know, we'd only ever train for Northern Europe.
I don't want to be boring and over-technical, but it's important this is understood. Under the Strategic Defence Review, the assumption was there'd never be more than a brigade, 7,000 or 8,000 ever, in a hot and sandy place. We more than doubled that because of the circumstances, and of course it wasn't. That kit was not on the shelves. It had to be bought in. The other problem was the green light for military preparation was not given till around Christmas, New Year, 2002. So there was under 3 months because of political sensitivity on the one hand and the US refusal to delay on the other. So that window was very, very tight.
Let me ask you then, both of you, what is your judgment on the war now?
Well, Rose is not the first next of kin that I have thought, was it worth it?
Mm-hmm.
And I leave my jury out, even now, the blood and the treasure that's been expended. And to be fair, the aim was to get Iraq into a better place and not a regional threat as it was and was growing.
Well, that was...
It doesn't look much like it at the moment.
No.
I have to accept that. But you know, I want to think that all that effort and sacrifice was not in vain.
Lord Faulkner, briefly.
We shouldn't have gone because the weapons of mass destruction were not there. I don't think that the war, though, has caused all of the problems that are now attributed to it.
And Rose, what do you want now? Beyond meeting Tony Blair, beyond that, what do you want?
I think there's still a lot more to come out. We got so much today, and as a mum that's lost a 19-year-old son, I need to know everything. And I think
do you want legal action?
I wouldn't even say we're going to get in for legal action. We need to find everything that's in these files and then maybe take advice.
Rose Gentle, thank you very, very much for coming in. General Lord Faulkner, thank you very much indeed. Matt.
Thanks, John. It wasn't just the politicians who were in the Chilcot firing line today. Both Britain's spy masters and the military top brass were given their share of the blame. The intelligence community had failed to make clear that they had not established beyond doubt that Iraq was continuing to produce chemical and biological weapons. And the Ministry of Defence had been slow to respond to the threat of improvised explosive devices and in providing equipment needed to protect the troops. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman looks at what went wrong in Iraq and why.
The Chilcot report doesn't whitewash Britain's biggest intelligence failure in decades. It quotes an MI6 officer saying the service marketed intelligence before checking it. It indicates that the MI6 chief, Sir Richard Dearlove, over-relied on an agent who was believed to be lying about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction even before the war began. This intelligence was shared with Number 10, but not with experts at the Ministry of Defence. Chilcot even suggests this Hollywood movie, The Rock, may have inspired MI6's source to invent a claim about a glass container full of chemical weapons.
Do you like the Elton John song Rocket Man?
And this morning, Sir John was about as blunt as civil servants get.
The judgments about the severity of the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, WMD, were presented with a certainty that was not justified.
Chilcot documents pressure from Jack Straw, then the Foreign Secretary, to strengthen a public document on Iraq's WMD threat. Should not Iraq be first and also have more text, he commented. The paper has to show why there is an exceptional threat from Iraq. It does not quite do this yet. But Chilcot accuses nobody of lying. Intelligence and assessments were used to prepare material to be used to support government statements in a way which conveyed certainty without acknowledging the limitations of the evidence. The Chilcot inquiry does not directly accuse 10 Downing Street of sexing up intelligence for political advantage. Instead, it says responsibility for the intelligence assessment lay with John Scarlett, the head of the Joint Intelligence Committee, a committee which it says did not even consider whether Saddam might not have weapons of mass destruction at any stage. John Scarlett then became the chief of MI6, to the anger of many of his colleagues, an appointment which might seem all the more remarkable today. Khan Ross was one of only 2 Foreign Office officials we know resigned over Iraq, and he welcomed Chilcot's findings.
I was very worried it would be a whitewash, or that the recommendations and the insights would be presented with a sort of lack of clarity and opaqueness that perhaps the Butler review did. I think it's very clear, it's very emphatic. So I think, air has been cleared. It's not, I would put it in other terms. The truth has finally been unarguably established.
The Chilcot report is no less damning about what happened after the invasion than before it. It says Mr. Blair agreed to send 3 combat brigades to Iraq without senior ministers meeting to discuss it, that the Americans gave the Prime Minister just 8 days' notice that the war was about to begin, and that when Mr. Blair set out his vision for Iraq in March 2003, no assessment had been made of whether that vision was achievable. No agreement had been reached with the US on a workable post-conflict plan, UN authorization had not yet been secured, and there had been no decision on the UN's role in post-conflict Iraq.
Despite explicit warnings, the consequences of the invasion were underestimated. The planning and preparations for Iraq after Saddam Hussein were wholly inadequate. The government failed to achieve its stated objectives.
Chilcot says British diplomats had little or no formal role in critical decision-making, including America's decision to disband the Iraqi army, with UK strategy far too reliant on talks not between officials, but between Tony Blair and George Bush.
Britain, all the way through this process, wasn't really taking responsibility. It didn't really feel it was in charge. It was hiding behind the fact it was part of a coalition. So a lot of the conversations, and you can see this going all the way through the Chilcot report, are people saying, oh, we thought the US was going to do that, or we were hoping the UN were going to step in and do that.
It took 4 years before the Ministry of Defence finally ordered patrol vehicles, which gave British troops extra protection from roadside bombs. British military commanders are accused of being far keener on getting out of Iraq than stabilising it. Between 2003 and 2009, the UK's most consistent strategic objective in relation to Iraq was to reduce the level of its deployed forces. The risk is that at 2.6 million words long, no minister or civil servant will actually read today's report. But its message, simply put, is this: don't go to war unless you challenge the intelligence first, and unless it's clear what you can achieve.
Jonathan Rugman with that report. Well, with 250 people now confirmed dead in the latest terror attack on Baghdad last weekend, Iraq is still as far as ever from the prospect of peaceful and prosperous future that Mr. Blair claimed to be seeking in his backing of the American-led invasion all those years ago. Well, our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, is with me now. I mean, I guess the obvious question is, Lindsay, did it need to be as bad as it is now? Was this inevitable?
Well, many people did predict that, but I was in Baghdad in the run-up to the war, and what I remember is how Iraqis were desperate for this war to happen because they wanted the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. Many of the people I knew had been in prison or had lost family members. They didn't care about the weapons of mass destruction. They used to say nothing could be as bad as living under Saddam Hussein. But what they found out afterwards was something could be as bad. And others of those Iraqi friends died in the aftermath. And people in Iraq are dying today. The numbers of the British dead are terrible, the 179 servicemen, but Iraqi civilians, they're the ones who have suffered in the greatest numbers, as Sir John Chilcot said today.
The invasion and subsequent instability in Iraq had, by July 2009, also resulted in the deaths of at least 150,000 Iraqis, and probably many more, most of them civilians. More than 1 million people were displaced.
Iraqi lives were overturned because their occupiers dismantled the state and were unprepared for the chaos created. The brutal order imposed by Saddam Hussein disintegrated into sectarian conflict. Shias and Sunnis fought and killed each other.
We should all recall the continuing suffering of innocent people in Iraq and those who have been killed and injured in terrorist attacks, including the latest horrific attack last Sunday, which killed more than 250 people.
Today, Iraqis gathered not to celebrate Eid, but to mourn those killed in that blast, carried out by Islamic State, a force that grew out of the US and UK occupation. They lit candles at the destroyed shopping centre. The reputations of British politicians, intelligence chiefs and generals have been damaged by the Chilcot report. The lives of many Iraqis have been destroyed.
Lindsay Hilsum. Well, joining me now is Emma Sky. She governed the Iraqi province of Kirkuk and served as a political advisor to the US military. Her book, The Unraveling, documents her experiences. With her is Colonel Tim Collins, who served in Iraq, the Iraqi journalist Namir Al-Mufti from Kirkuk, and Bayan Sami Abdurrahman, a Kurdish diplomat in Washington. Welcome to you all. Let me start with you, Emma. You had this extraordinary experience when you arrived in Iraq, where you didn't quite know what you were getting yourself into, but you ended up as the governor of Kirkuk, which you hadn't expected. Just tell us about that briefly.
Well, I was somebody who was very much against the Iraq war. But after the invasion, the British government sent out an email asking for volunteers to go out to Iraq for 3 months to administer the country before we handed it back to the Iraqis. And I'd spent a decade working in the Palestinian territories, so I had skills in capacity building and conflict mediation, so I thought I had some useful skills to offer. And I wanted to go out to apologize to Iraqis for the war and to help them rebuild their country. I didn't want the only foreigner that Iraqis got to meet to be a man with a gun. So I responded to the email. But before I left, I didn't know what my job was going to be. I didn't receive any briefing. I just had one phone call from somebody in London saying, find your way to RAF Brize Norton, jump on a plane, get to Basra. You'll be met by somebody holding a sign with your name on it and taken to the nearest hotel, and everything will be explained. Now, it sounded plausible. The invasion had been 3 months prior. I assumed the British government knew what it was doing, they just hadn't told me. So I followed the instructions, arrived in Basra, and nobody was expecting me. There was nobody, no sign with my name on it. So I spent my first night sleeping in the airport in Basra. And the next day, I found a plane that was going to Baghdad. So I flew up to Baghdad. From there, I made my way to the Green Zone, to the Republican Palace that had been Saddam's headquarters and was now the headquarters of the Coalition Provisional Authority. So I said, hello, I'm Emma from England, here to volunteer. And I received my first briefing then. It was from a British colonel who told me that the security situation in Iraq was stable and things were fine. And they said, we've got enough people in Baghdad, try the north. But they didn't say where. So I flew to Mosul and they said, we've got somebody here, keep on going. So I kept on going until I got to Kirkuk. And when I arrived in Kirkuk, I was told I was the senior civilian in the province, reporting directly to Ambassador Bremer.
So when you told John Chilcot this story, apparently he fell off his chair. He couldn't believe it.
Well,
literally.
Yes, I mean, his jaw just hung. They just couldn't believe that I'd ended up so randomly in such a position. I mean, I had never run a town in the UK, let alone, a province in someone else's country. And in my first week in Kirkuk, I survived an assassination attempt.
Extraordinary. Let's turn to Kirkuk and to Nermeen Al-Mufti. Nermeen, I'm not sure if you just heard that, and I apologize, there's a bit of a delay on the line, but how does that strike you, that this well-meaning foreigner arrives in Kirkuk and as soon as she gets there, she's made governor of your province? Astonishing stuff.
Excuse me, your voice is not clear so much for me. Please, may you repeat?
Okay. Did you just hear the story that Emma Sky was telling us, that when she arrived in Iraq just after the war, she was made the governor of the province of Kirkuk without having expected to be given this job at all? And it was an example of the sheer incompetence and shambolic planning of the entire aftermath.
It is now after 13 years of this violence and this very chaotic situation in Iraq, it is now very obvious, or it's very clear that the British or the Americans or this, when they planned to invade Iraq, they did not plan what they are going to do after toppling Saddam Hussein, or after finished with the war or the invasion. So it is a very clear example.
Do you wish they had never come to your country?
Yes. I am an Iraqi. I am an Iraqi journalist for the last 34 years. I'm a journalist in Iraq. I'm based in Baghdad. We, inside Iraq, by the mid of the 90s, we were planning. I know our task was very hard and very tough, but we were planning from inside Iraq how to topple Saddam Hussein. We are working. We have from inside and from outside. We are working together. Many were discovered and were executed, but we were working. Maybe it's not going to be in this way in April or 3 maybe, but we are planning. I didn't know, not only myself, millions of Iraqis didn't wish to be in this situation now in Iraq.
Okay, let's turn to Bayan Sami Abdulrahman in Washington. You just heard what we heard there from Kirkuk, but for you, Tony Blair and indeed George Bush were heroes, weren't they? Because they liberated, in your book, the Kurdish people.
Yes, and I would like to actually take this opportunity to express my genuine and sincere condolences to the families of the British soldiers who were killed. We did see it as a liberation because Saddam was a warmonger. He created wars in the region. He was a destabilizing factor. 800,000, maybe 1 million people died in the Iran-Iraq war. He invaded Kuwait. He killed hundreds of thousands, countless Iraqis, many of them Kurds. He used chemical weapons. Even today we discover mass graves going back to the 70s and 80s. So absolutely,
Kurds are the only winners in this, aren't they?
From a dictator.
But the Kurds are the only winners in this conflict at the moment, aren't they?
Iraq as a whole could have been a winner. I don't want to get into internal British politics and the debate over who said what in the UK context. But what I think hasn't really been part of the debate that I've heard, obviously I'm in Washington, but I've been following events today on the internet and television. What I haven't seen in the debate is the fact that the Iraqi leadership needs to take a great deal of responsibility for what's happened. Also, many of the regional players in the Middle East did their utmost to make sure that Britain and the United States failed. I haven't really seen that in the debate. Perhaps it's part of the Chilcot report, but I haven't seen it to be being reported by the media.
Okay. All right. Tim Collins, let me turn to you. I mean, you gave a very inspiring speech on the eve of war. You told your soldiers that they were entering the land in which Abraham had been born, the Garden of Eden had been located there, to tread lightly. Now, the exact opposite happened, didn't it? What were the key military failures, and when did you realize that we'd gone wrong?
Well, the key military failures really were things that we knew about beforehand. In my previous job in Special Forces, and I say this without breaking any confidentialities of government because it's in the public domain, the message we were giving clearly to the Iraqi military was that topple Saddam, and if you topple him, we will back you. And what's more, if we topple him, we need you, the military, to help us rebuild Iraq. That was the message sent very clearly. When we crossed the border, I surrounded myself with Iraqi advisors, and they had a lot of good ideas about what needed to happen. They even knew the exchange rate for the dollar, so they knew what needed to happen. And initially, it went extremely well.
Best laid plans at the beginning.
But whatever happened, particularly in the south, there was a great deal of incompetence. There was a planned uprising by the Ba'ath Party. We saw that in the area I was looking after. There was a plan to murder the people who were advising me. I dealt with them first, and I was accused of war crimes. That ended my career. But that frightened commanders to a point where they ended up negotiating with the militias. They were beaten, but beaten from home. But ultimately, what comes down to it, the great blunder was there was no planning for what should have happened, and disbanding the army, and not listening to the Iraqis who knew what we should have been doing.
Okay, and just very briefly, Emma, I mean, when you look at it now, is there anything that could have been done that would have actually saved the situation from what it's deteriorated to, or was all of this inevitable?
I don't believe that any of this was inevitable. I don't think any of this was preordained. There really was, as Bayan said, there was hopes for a world without Saddam Hussein and missed opportunities to create that better order. So the big mistakes made in 2003 were de-Baathification, dissolving the military, which collapsed the state and led Iraq into civil war. But from 2007 to 2009 was the only time in the whole war that the coalition had the right strategy, the right leadership and the right resources, and helped bring all Iraqis together. It took Iraq out of the civil war. Iraq went back into civil war after the 2010 elections were so tightly contested. It is all about the failure of Iraqi politics, and the Iraqi political elites themselves must take huge responsibility for what we see today.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. I'm very sorry to all of you. We've run out of time. Emma Sky, Tim Collins, Nareen Al-Mufti and Bayan Sami Abdulrahman. Thank you very much indeed to all of you. John.
After the break, as Jeremy Corbyn apologises for his party's central role in the Iraq War, we debate how the Chilcot report has affected the already turbulent British political scene today. Today's Chilcot report has come at a moment of intense political instability. Tonight, the Conservatives are arguing about who should be the next leader and Prime Minister, while the Labour Party has its own Iraq-inspired struggle. The present leader, Jeremy Corbyn, today apologised for his party's role in the Iraq War, which he described as Britain's most serious foreign policy calamity in 60 years.
The war was not in any way, as Sir John Chilcot says, a last resort. Frankly, it was an act of military aggression launched on a false pretext, as the inquiry accepts, and has long been regarded as illegal by the overwhelming weight of international legal opinion.
We're joined from Barcelona now by Tony Blair's former Director of Communications, Alistair Campbell, and with me in the studio are the artists Brian Eno and Sarah O'Connor, whose brother, Sergeant Bob O'Connor, was killed in Iraq. Sarah O'Connor, how has the report affected you?
I thought that today I was going to complete my circle of grieving and receive closure. I'm absolutely delighted with the findings, and I apologise to Sir Chilcot because I was one of those that's been very outspoken because I was concerned that the balance was going to tip in the favour of those who were held to account.
You didn't think be as strong as it is?
Absolutely. I had lost faith, and I had been very open about that. What it's done, though, instead of that circle closing, it's now opened another circle, and unfortunately we're going to go back round again.
Alistair Campbell, what did you make of the report? Is it what you expected or tougher than you expected?
Well, I think in parts it is very, very tough, and I think that I didn't see all of Tony Blair's press conference, but I know that there's a lot of the criticisms that he does accept. But I do think that on the basic decision that he made, and which ultimately he as Prime Minister had to make, I don't think he does resile from that, and I don't think he ever will. Because I think he was serious and remains serious about what he sees as the real threat in our world today, which is this possibility of rogue or failed states with the potential to develop weapons of mass destruction falling into the hands of terrorists with real intent against all of our countries. And I think that's why people say of their political leaders that they want them to stand up and,
that was taken
and
and
say
he has
what
to
they
stand
believe,
by
and
that
that is
decision.
what he
He is
believes.
the person that actually tipped that domino. And that domino effect has been felt all the way around the world. We still have Iraqis being killed today. We ended up with an ungoverned state, so all the terrorist factions could move in. So what about the threat to the world?
We've done a lot of work tonight on Iraq and what it's done to Iraq and all the decisions and the rest of it. What's it done to Britain? What has this war done to Britain? And is it part of the story of the breakdown of trust between people and politicians?
Yes, I think it is. And I think it's also part of the story about the loss of faith in the media, actually, because, of course, this war was very heavily supported by the media, thanks partly to Alistair Campbell, who stirred the pot as well as he could. And, you had the whole of the Murdoch press, 360 outlets, monolithically in support of the war. So if you don't have any kind of investigative journalism to poke the many holes that could have been poked in this, the stirring of this war, the dodgy dossier and so on, if you don't have journalists who are doing their work, then you don't have the basis of a democracy. How are we supposed to operate with incorrect information?
Alistair Campbell?
John, can I come in there? Because, I mean, you can hardly say, you just mentioned the so-called dodgy dossier. I mean, for 13 years, I have had to face allegations, which this is the fourth report to say that they are not true, that I falsified intelligence, that I played around with that intelligence to let Tony Blair persuade a reluctant Parliament to go to war, and that just was not true. And there's no, yes, John, your question about is this partly responsible for the breakdown in trust? Yes is the answer, but if you have relentlessly people saying, despite inquiries...
One moment, please. I mean, this was a PhD treatise written by a man in California that ended up as some kind of a dossier. That was a dodgy dossier, like it or not.
John, excuse me. No, John. No, sorry, John. You're deliberately conflating, as you've done for years, two totally different documents. That was a document that went to about 8 journalists and it got about 4 paragraphs of coverage. The September 2002 weapons of mass destruction.
Okay, we will take that as read.
Like you at the time,
take that as read.
This isn't going to.
We'll take that as read.
Listen,
but we
cannot. No, John, you cannot just state those things. There was no lying. There was no deceit. There was no bad faith. Now, it may pain people to hear me still say that, but it happens to be true.
Okay, let me give you the. What do you want to say to Alistair Campbell?
Alistair, of course you have to say that ultimately that what you did with the intelligence and how you aided Tony Blair to try and present himself as a man who took the right decision. We were not ready, we were not equipped, and there was not enough evidence to support the fact that we were going to go in and decimate a country that reverberates around the world and as an indelible stain now, not only on our government for this generation and generations to come, but for all of those around the world. It's about time. Instead of us taking responsibility, you take responsibility.
We're very close to coming off air, Alistair Campbell. You've got about 20 seconds to give your answer there.
Well, all I can say, listen, I do understand why people feel so strongly about this. But I would simply say, as Tony Blair said today, there is one country in that region that is at least a democracy now and that is actually joining in this fight against the terrorism. And I do think it is too simplistic to say that Iraq happened and that has created ISIS. It is much, much more complicated.
Alistair Campbell, I must pause you there. But just a final thought as to how you repair this breach of trust, as you say, with the media and with the political classes. And we have very little time.
Well, I think one of the things you can do is to stop looking for charismatic politicians. Charismatic politicians are dangerous, and they're thrilled by each other's charisma, as Bush and Blair were. They were like two college students together, I think, egging each other on to this stupid war. We've got to get rid of that idea of those kinds of personality politicians, I think.
So much to do. Thank you very much, all three of you, and little time to do it. Before we go, we leave you with some of the images from Iraq's past and present. Good evening.
الرد جعل يعطي منا وعده ومنا وعده ومكتوب